From the time of nationalisation, the fortunes of Great Britain's once profitable railways had been falling into loss, and much of the blame was placed on the steam locomotive and the paraphernalia which accompanied it. British Railways had made a determined effort to stamp out this scourge. Only by eliminating steam could its wonderful new railway rise again. In fact, it wasn't just the steam locomotive that BR wanted to eliminate. It had inherited a railway system which hadn't really changed in essence from Victorian days, and it still had plenty of Victorian buildings, Victorian equipment and Victorian attitudes when the second half of the 20th century came along. In 1955, the British Transport Commission had announced its modernisation plan, under which it proposed to replace steam with electrics wherever possible, and with diesels where it wasn't possible. It expected this to take about 25 to 30 years. It didn't. Just 13 years after the plan was announced, the last steam locomotives were retired. At the time British Railways rebranded itself as British Rail, on the 1st of January 1965, there were still steam locomotives working on every region of the system, but not everywhere on the system. On the newly electrified West Coast Main Line, steam locomotives had been banned from working under the wires. Many of the survivors were even branded to show their inferior status by the simple expedient of having a broad yellow stripe painted on their cab sides across their numbers. It was hardly necessary, as all railway staff knew they couldn't run under the wires anyway. The great electrification project on the West Coast Main Line had only been authorised as far as Weaver Junction, just to the south of Warrington. It was therefore on this northern part of the network where steam would stage its last stand. To the generations of boys for whom railways were an obsession, the word hobby seems to be insufficient as a description of their passion. The most exciting place to be was the loco yard, or, more correctly, the engine shed. It was in these cathedrals of steam that the steam locomotives were serviced, cleaned and occasionally repaired. Day-to-day servicing included taking on water and coal, filling the sandboxes to enable a steam locomotive to grip the rails in slippery conditions, cleaning them and disposing them at the end of a tour of duty or preparing them before one. Steam locomotives were allocated to individual sheds and bore small cast metal plaques at the bottom of their smoke boxes showing this allocation. The shed was then responsible for keeping the locomotive in working condition and thus available for its required duties. The locomotive's number was displayed on a cast metal plate at the top of the smoke box. At the very end they became collector's items and were removed, as seen on, or rather not on, this black 5. These number plates and allocation plaques were an inheritance from the London, Midland and Scottish Railway, the largest company to form part of British Railways. Despite BR's programme of steam locomotive construction, its standard range, it was to be the LMS Black 5s built to the design of Sir William Stanier, which were to be the most numerous locomotives left on the last official working day of British steam, on the 4th of August 1968. 1 week later, 3 of them would participate in the very final steam working of all, the so-called 15 guineas special, which was run over the famous Settle and Carlisle line to mark the end of working steam on British Railways. Although the Ivat Tank and 8F still had their smokebox number plates, by the end many locomotives were unidentifiable and their condition summed up all the reasons British Rail had given for its need to eliminate steam. When labour was cheap and plentiful, and the railways were seen as a well-paid and secure job for life, school leavers would sign up for a career with good prospects. The new recruit would undertake menial duties around the locomotive shed, such as cleaning out the ash pits, into which the clinker and ash from the fireboxes of the locomotives would be thrown. He, only during the wars had women done this type of work, would then progress to being a cleaner, responsible for keeping the locomotives spick and span, and he'd also be responsible for cleaning out the ashes from them and also lighting them up. As a past cleaner, he would be able to do some work on the footplate around the shed environs. The next stage would bring him to the position of fireman, an arduous task for which fit young men were needed. Progressing to the top, he would first become a past fireman, who was passed to drive some locomotives, before finally ascending the ladder to become a driver. It took a working lifetime to reach the highest footplate position of all, a top link driver, at the regulator of the fastest express locomotives. At every grade there were variations, depending on what the principal work was at a specific shed: shunting, freight, local passenger or express passenger. In the heyday of the railways before the First World War, a top link driver was a very special kind of man with a position to which many youngsters aspired. The long climb up the promotion ladder was an accepted part of life and wasn't even questioned. But wartime changed all that, and working on a steam locomotive could be an arduous and dirty job. There were, of course, non-footplate jobs at the shed. Clerical staff were needed for wages work, rostering of locomotives, keeping the locomotive history records, and an overall man in charge, the shedmaster. But all had to work in the same conditions, conditions which the post-war generations had seen and rejected. Throughout its existence, British Railways had been faced with recruitment problems. It wasn't just the physical conditions which were a deterrent, the long time to climb the ladder was another. The lack of new staff meant that the conditions at the sheds grew worse over time, thus compounding the problem for the employer. It started in the cities, so the locomotives from city-based sheds were the first whose appearance started to fall off, whilst the country sheds were able to maintain standards for longer. But it was, above all, the massive amount of labour needed to keep steam operational that told against it, and the acceleration of the planned demise of steam wasn't simply a matter of vengeful management trying to destroy it. It was a matter of necessity. The first British rail region to abolish steam was the Western. In the mid-1960s, the remaining steam locomotives were but a pale shadow of the once proud Great Western Fleet. Even the mighty castles were looking ready to meet their makers. This one, Gloucester Castle, had already lost its smokebox number plate whilst retaining its nameplates shortly before its September 1963 withdrawal. It was one of the last castles to be built and had a working life of just 14 years. The final Western Region steam passenger train was run on the 11th of June 1965 and was seen off in some style from Paddington Station. The locomotive was 7029 Cluncastle, which was to be purchased directly from service afterwards for the embryo Birmingham Railway Museum at the old Tyseley shed in that city. This wouldn't actually be Clun's last run on British Rail metals, as she would be kept in working condition at Tyseley and work a number of specials in the next few years across the network. Although this was the official end of steam passenger work on the Western Region, the actual end took place on the 6th of March 1966, when the Somerset and Dorset line, which had been passed to the Western Region, finally closed. But on the real Western, the old Great Western, the new order was to be seen at places such as Plymouth, where the new, or rebuilt in 1962, station was now the only station in the city, following closures as a result of the Beeching cuts. Warships in Plymouth could be seen on either the sea or the rails, as Western trains were still distinctive, boasting their own variation on the dieselisation policy in the form of the hydraulic classes. The warships were being used in multiple in the mid-1960s to speed up the principal trains to the West Country. Elimination of steam didn't just mean the elimination of steam locomotives. In particular, the great steam sheds were now redundant and the water cranes were pulled up and melted down for scrap, as were the tracks and the associated infrastructure. Sidings became redundant as the patterns of freight traffic moved rapidly away from pick-up freights and local services, all condemned by Dr. Beeching as hopelessly uneconomic for the railways. In their place would come liner trains and bulk long-distance company trains. Shed buildings would be torn down, many sites simply then being left to go back to nature, as their soil had been contaminated after a century or more of sustained heavy industrial use. But it was the speed of change which struck many people. The railways pulled out of serving many shipping ports, leaving yet more land to be redeveloped. Particularly noticeable was the removal of the traditional semaphore signalling on most of the main lines. Over the previous century, semaphore signalling had been developed to a high standard, but its reliance on large staff numbers and its relatively high maintenance costs meant that it had to go. In any event, it was associated with the traditional railway, and there were members of the British Railways Board, the actual company name hadn't changed, who were known to be intent on eliminating any associations with the steam age as quickly as possible. Dr. Beeching hadn't specifically described semaphore signalling as one of the major expenses that British Rail should try to eliminate. His brief had been to make the railways pay, or more realistically, stop them losing money. His report concentrated on traffic flows and the costs of running branch lines, stations, types of traffic, and the occasional use of certain types of assets, such as coaching stock kept for seasonal trains and used as little as 18 times a year. Semaphore signalling was simply a major labour-intensive cost within the overall costs of running the railway. The removal of semaphore signalling didn't just mean the removal of signals. Important junctions and stations would have numerous signal boxes, and these would in general be demolished, as the new signalling would be electric colour light signals controlled remotely from signalling centres. The whole appearance of the railway was to change during the modernisation process. With the replacement of labour-intensive installations would go the need for many other buildings and equipment. Improvements in track technology and the use of on-track machinery to check track conditions would eliminate the need for linesmen, the staff who walked along the tracks every day to keep them in good order. Those men had needed mess rooms, equipment stores, lineside huts and offices. All these could go now. Many of the remaining stations, which used to boast large complements of staff, would have all their buildings demolished and just a simple shelter, similar to and known as a bus shelter, erected for passenger use. Along with these would go the goods yards as local freight operations ceased, and the whole effect was to change the face of the railways forever. But it was the elimination of steam and the reduction of the magnificent former kings of the rails that attracted the most attention.
Nothing to touch them. Their days are numbered and the real veterans are being broken up. Here at Swindon, where many thousands have been built over the past 100 years or so, the old-timers are being turned into scrap. Rather sad, really, and it does seem a harsh fate after all the faithful service they've given. Most of this lot date from the 1920s, but they won't be quite forgotten. There's a big demand for the old number plates as souvenirs for collectors. Still, progress is progress, I suppose, and British Railways must diesel on.
During the 1960s, the sight of apparently modern steam locomotives being cut up for scrap was one which tore at the hearts of railway enthusiasts. One spin-off was that the nameplates became valuable souvenirs of once-loved locomotives, and a ready market began to appear. The value of these was going to grow during the decade, and it soon became accepted practice to remove them from steam locomotives which were still at work, to prevent them being acquired by souvenir hunters. By the end of steam, virtually none of them remained on the locomotives, and their poor condition made it extremely difficult to identify any individual machine. The scrapping of locomotives, while shocking to enthusiasts, was really just a part of the normal policy of renewal on the railways, and had been going on since the beginning. In fact, there was a certain bizarre fascination in observing the inner workings of the steam engine being revealed, as its outer parts were steadily stripped away. Although the modernisation plan of 1955 envisaged the elimination of steam, it hadn't forecast quite such a rapid reduction in the overall fleet as actually happened. In the early 1960s, the locomotives going to the torch were mostly engines inherited by the big four companies in 1923 from the original private companies. To these were soon added the earlier types produced by the big four themselves, the early LMS types seen here being particularly frequent members of the One-Way Journey Club. This was for a number of reasons, the first simply being that there were more of them. The LMS had been the biggest of the big four, and so it had more steam locomotives in its fleet. The second reason was that it had built a great number of already obsolescent locomotives in the early days of grouping, and these were always likely to be early candidates for withdrawal. A third reason was a logical extension of the others. Because it had so many obsolescent locomotives, the London Midland region was the subject of the largest part of the modernisation plan's investment in new diesel power, and of course the massive electrification programme associated with the West Coast Main Line. It should also be remembered that huge numbers of wagons were being cut up alongside the locomotives during the same period, as the modernisation plan's aim of reducing the old-fashioned wagon fleet was embarked upon, and this was to be accelerated considerably in the mid-1960s after the publication of the Beeching report. To the scrapman, the origin of the locomotive or wagon he's cutting up matters not a jot. Locomotives from different companies would be disassembled alongside one another with complete impunity. At the end of the day, they were merely sources of scrap material for recycling and from which to make a living. Actually, the latter was a phenomenon which only started to make itself felt in the 1960s as the reduction in the steam fleet gathered pace. Traditionally, steam locomotives tended to be scrapped at the same places where they had been built, the railway workshops. Over the years, many parts were simply removed from locomotives for reuse before the actual cutting took place, as standardisation had been in vogue on most railways well before the British Railways standard steam locomotive range was mooted. During the rundown of the BR fleet, there was little of this, other than the cannibalising of withdrawn locomotives to keep remaining members of their classes at work when still required. Long lines of locomotives awaiting their fate became a familiar sight around the railway workshops in the early 1960s, but they were soon to take up valuable working space. The works started to fall behind in the scrapping, so British Railways started to look to other ways in order to speed the process up and rid itself of the unwanted locomotives. Private enterprise proved to be the solution. Numerous scrapyards existed around the country, and they were encouraged to start taking the redundant locomotives. Many existed in South Wales, which was the heart of the steel industry, and where there was always a demand for steel for recycling. Gradually, names such as Cashmore's in Newport, Birds of Risca, and Wards of Briton Ferry were added to the pantheon of names associated with the railways. These companies tended at first to deal with the locomotives on their own doorstep, but they were soon tendering for locomotives from across the nation, which would be delivered to them in sad convoys of dilapidated wrecks. Before the involvement of the South Wales scrapyards, Swindon Works had taken pride in the recycling of the locomotives it had built, as seen in the newsreel footage. The so-called dump outside the works had featured in many railway history books when the Great Western Railway had changed from the broad gauge to the standard gauge in the late 19th century. The locomotive boiler we see here, being dismantled in the 1960s, owed its design to the series of standard boilers introduced by Churchward in the first decade of the 20th century. In all essentials, it boasted the same dimensions and design, although many improvements had been made over the next half-century. The standard GWR boilers had been moved from locomotive to locomotive as they were overhauled, many different classes using the same type of boiler. The boiler and other parts seen being cut up here could have come from any of those types of locomotive, as almost all the features of GWR locomotives were standardised: cylinders, wheels, bogies, cab size, tenders, and of course the boilers themselves. The pair of outside cylinders being cut here could have come from one of many apparently different types of Great Western locomotives. Like the boilers, the standard cylinders have been used on many locomotive types. Most of the parts used in new locomotives would have been fitted on earlier ones, although they've been subjected to modernisation and improvements in almost all essentials, with the exception of the dimensions. The result of this great standardisation policy, the most extensive in British railway history, was that the Great Western had kept an appearance of continuity whilst keeping up to date in engineering and operating practice. It would bear directly onto British Railway's own standardisation policies, as William Stanier was recruited by the LMS Railway in the 1930s from Swindon to rescue it from its appalling legacy. He introduced many features of the GWR standardisation policy to LMS locomotives, which was subsequently continued by British Railways. So the word standard had originally meant Great Western to many railwaymen, and the most noticeable feature of standardisation was the boiler, which set the character of a locomotive. A major part of the Great Western's heritage was the decoration of its boilers. The standard locomotives were adorned with brass safety valve covers and, on the principal express types, copper cap chimneys. These, like the nameplates and number plates, would become collector's items, whilst the rest of the locomotives would be consigned to the scrap heap. But cutting up the boilers was the most difficult task. The last user of this standard No. 1 boiler was Oakley Hall, which had been withdrawn from Gloucester Shed in January 1965 and dispatched, somewhat unusually still bearing its smokebox number plate, to Swindon for scrapping, which we see taking place barely a month later in February 1965. This was to be the last year in which scrapping took place at Swindon in large numbers because, as we've seen, Western Steam was to be finally withdrawn from the region by the middle of the year. Swindon, with the aid of some of the South Wales private yards, had kept up with the withdrawal programme remarkably well. One aspect of the steam locomotive would live on, in a very different form. The fireboxes, made of copper, would be recycled to make, amongst other things, the copper overhead wires used to transmit power to the new electric trains, which were now taking over in increasing numbers on the main lines. So perhaps it's now time to examine the state of the newer parts of the railway. As steam was finally phased out, the Great West Coast Electrification project was soon to be completed. From the middle of 1966, electric trains would leave from Euston Station for Liverpool and Manchester, and within a year the whole project would be completed. As always, the most visible part of the transition from the old to the new railway was the change in the locomotive fleet. On the West Coast, the original order for 100 electric locomotives of 5 main types had been followed up with a production order for 100 of a new type designed as a result of the experience gained from the earlier machines. The new locomotives were type AL6, and 60 were built by BR at Doncaster during 1965 and 66, whilst a further 40 came from English Electric during the same period. However, English Electric had missed out on the largest second-generation diesel order. The standard Type 4 order had been secured by Brush Traction of Loughborough, 512 examples of which were to be built there between 1962 and 1968. They were used on all parts of the system, only the West Coast main line seeing little of their presence. The southern region also saw few of them, as it had a single diesel type of its own, the Type 3 engines, which were commonly known as Cromptons, on account of their power units. English Electric did, however, have the order for the standard Type 3 for the British Rail fleet, which was for 309 1,750 horsepower locomotives for general use on the system, production of which took place from 1960 until 1965. Most were built at the famous Vulcan Works at Newton-le-Willows in Lancashire, alongside the West Coast main line, but some were built in Darlington at the works of Robert Stephenson's and Hawthorne, which famous name company had become part of the English Electric Group in 1955. The design of these Type 3s was based on the very first mainline diesel locomotives produced by the LMS with English Electric mechanical parts as far back as 1947, so they'd been well proved in service. They were intended for mixed traffic duties, as were all the early diesels, and were to be seen all across the country, frequently on the ever-expanding network of Freightliner services, one of the positive aspects of the Beeching plan for the railways, which was having such a drastic effect on the railways of Britain during the mid-1960s. Another effect of the Beeching plan, well known for its pruning of the actual railway track mileage, was an effective speeding up of the dieselisation policy, which had been gathering momentum from the late 1950s. As lines closed, so would the requirement for locomotives be reduced. This meant that diesels intended for older services, which had now disappeared, would be available elsewhere and thus supplant steam locomotives at a faster rate. It also meant that the new standard diesel classes would be seen across the remaining network on the prestige trains and further reinforce the spirit of change. However, many observers thought that the English electric Type 3s harked back to the first generation diesel outline with their pronounced nose ends, whilst the brush Type 4s looked to the future with their more modern flush ends. Both would prove to have extremely long service records, lasting in frontline service into the era of privatisation at the end of the century. Brush, having become part of the Hawker-Siddeley Group in 1966, remained an active player in the British Railways market and would be the leading supplier of new locomotives, including reworking the Type 4s, until the end of British Railways' own existence. The new Type 4s would ultimately take over much of the role of the Western region's Western diesel hydraulics, as that bold experiment was declared non-standard by British Rail towards the end of the 1960s, the much reduced network being easily worked by the large numbers of the standard classes, as the effects of the reshaping of British Railways continued on their way. English Electric had a consolation prize in the second generation Type 4 category, when it supplied a series of 50 Type 4 machines during 1967-68 for use on the West Coast Main Line north of Crewe to Glasgow, as part of the final rundown and elimination of steam on that route. They were supplied under a unique arrangement whereby English Electric retained ownership and leased them to British Rail, an arrangement which lasted for 5 years and was the company's last involvement with British locomotion. The rundown of steam continued across the railways of Great Britain throughout the 1960s. On British Rail, most modern freight was placed in the hands of the new diesels, as they were equipped with the new air brakes to run with the new wagons. Many of the earlier diesels had dual braking so that they could handle both the new and old types of wagons, while steam locomotives were never considered for fitting with modern air braking. Steam and the old freight stock were to be eliminated concurrently. Steam would, however, remain in Great Britain on the many privately preserved lines which were being established in the 1960s, and curiously on the one narrow gauge line still owned by British Rail in North Wales, the Vale of Rheidol. London Transport would keep a few ex-Western region pannier tanks in action until the end of the decade, and many industrial concerns still boasted fleets of small steam shunters. Amongst these was the Ford Motor Company at its Dagenham works in East London, which had also been one of the earliest adopters of diesel traction. These dated back as far as 1932, when 3 American boxcar-style diesel shunters had been set to work. They would be retired even before steam had been eliminated in Great Britain. Ford also became one of the railway's best customers, using dedicated containers on railway wagons to transport car parts from its various works in Europe, as well as using the British Rail car-carrying trains to distribute complete cars and vans. The second British Rail region to eliminate steam was the Scottish region, some 3 months after the closure of the Somerset and Dorset. That left pockets of steam in the north-east on the Eastern region and the north-west on the London Midland region, both using steam to deal almost entirely with freight traffic. Only on the southern region, which boasted the last steam main line to Southampton, Bournemouth and Weymouth, was steam still used on express passenger services. Serving the south coast, and in particular the London suburbs and the Channel ports, the Southern had commenced electrifying its network on the third rail system from before the 1923 grouping. Steam locomotives had been of secondary importance, the early express classes such as the Maunsell Lord Nelsons, seen here, being relegated to services such as the ocean liner expresses from Southampton docks in the 1950s. These magnificent machines, once the most powerful steam locomotives in Great Britain, were to be withdrawn by the end of 1962, together with most of the pre-war Southern steam locomotives. This was in accordance with the Southern's own long-term locomotive strategy, which was to replace steam progressively by electrification. The plan had merely been delayed by nationalisation and British Railways' lack of funding, and had resumed with the Kent Coast schemes of the 1950s. Now it was time to deal with its core route. Southampton was central to the Southern system in many ways, docks having been massively developed by the railway company between the wars, and it was the source and destination for the largest part of its freight traffic. Special shunting locomotives had been part of its charm, notably the post-war American USA shunters. These were replaced from 1962 by a fleet of Ruston and Hornsby diesels, which were unique within the British Railways diesel fleet. Sadly, their working lives were short, as the docks traffic fell away very rapidly at the end of the decade, as containerisation took hold and a new Freightliner depot was built further along the River Test to handle this traffic. The first fruits of the reignition of the Southern's electrification policy were a bit of an oddity, but still conformed to the Southern strategy. The Isle of Wight Railways had been operated by a fleet of elderly steam locomotives comprised of old London and South Western Railway Class O2 tank engines. Originally built for London suburban and branch line work in the 1880s, many of the class had been rendered redundant in the early 1920s by electrification, so were transferred to the island. There they held sway until the 1960s, when Dr. Beeching proposed closure of all the remaining island lines. Vigorous local opposition to this resulted in retention of a short stretch from Ryde to Shanklin, and the question was how to modernise it at minimum cost. At the time, London Transport was replacing its standard stock, dating from 1923, and they were available at scrap prices. The Southern bought some and refurbished them. Just as the O2s before them had emigrated to the island, so did 6 3-car and 6 4-car former underground units to create an electrified system of just 8.5 miles in length. Much of the Southern's core main line to Wessex already had electric third rails in place, and Dr. Beeching took care of what to do with the long straggling main line beyond Salisbury to the West Country by passing it over to the Western region. The main line to Southampton, Bournemouth and Weymouth remained, and was still steam worked. In the very financially straitened times of the early 1960s, British Rail either wasn't willing or wasn't able to finance another full-scale electrification scheme, one which wasn't included in the still current modernisation plan. Previous mainline electrification schemes had included new locomotives and stock, or new electric multiple units. The Mark I coaches of British Railways were still in production in the early 1960s, and there was no question of replacing them for electrification. Waterloo, to use the common nickname of the Southern management team, came up with an ingenious cut-price electrification scheme which met with the approval of the BR Board, as it meant that the Southern would comply with the Board's aim to eliminate steam entirely. In essence, the line from Bournemouth to Weymouth would use the surplus diesels, as the economic case for this part of the route was slightly dubious. These were to be fitted with Southern electric multiple unit connections to enable them to be remotely controlled from a standard Southern multiple unit cab. The latter were to be fitted to a number of the standard Mark I coaches, which would be formed into unpowered sets, which the diesels would propel from Weymouth to Bournemouth. The electrification would commence there, and high-powered electric units, again using some of the Mark I coaches, will then haul the train sets which had come from Weymouth to London, leaving the diesels at Bournemouth to reverse the process for trains from London. It was a remarkably efficient system and a very flexible one. The high-power units used at the London end of the trains on the electrified part of the line boasted 3,300 horsepower and 100 miles an hour maximum speed. The non-powered units looked to all intents and purposes the same as electric units, but were either pulled or pushed by the powered ones or the diesels. With up to 8 unpowered coaches being pushed at speeds up to 100 miles an hour, there were some questions about their safety, as this was to be the first time in the world where such practice was to be undertaken. Previous push-pull trains had been used on local services at low speeds with short trains. Tests were undertaken, and the working arrangements were found to be perfectly safe. Born of necessity, the cut-price Bournemouth electrification turned out to be a world beater, as the high-speed push-pull principle would be adopted on railways across the globe, as well as 20 years later on the West Coast Main Line, the hugely expensive flagship scheme of British Rail. Use of the diesels wasn't confined to the Weymouth line. Waterloo was still responsible for local services as far as Salisbury on the West of England Main Line, and there was no prospect of electrification from Basingstoke to Salisbury. The use of the diesels with the unpowered push-pull stock enabled the Southern to integrate these services with the electric ones, they being in effect pseudo-electrics. Proof of the pudding was the famous Sparks effect. Prices of houses in the New Forest and places such as Winchester soared, and the passengers flocked back to the railway. Implementation of the Bournemouth electrification on the 10th of July 1967 meant that the last steam main line would be no more. Towards the end, many special trains would be run using native locomotives, but one visitor was especially welcome. This was Sir Nigel Gresley, the locomotive named in honour of the great engineer and a member of his most famous class, the A4 Pacifics. Marginally more famous was the world steam speed record holder Mallard, but Sir Nigel held his own record, the highest recorded post-war steam speed. The locomotive had been purchased by a group of railway enthusiasts from British Rail in full operating condition, whilst the iconic speedster had been preserved for the nation and would become a museum piece, stuffed and mounted. Sir Nigel Gresley is seen here on shed at the last mainline loco shed in London, 9 Elms. It came to work 2 rail tours on the Southern Main Line on June the 3rd and 4th, 1967, just 5 weeks before the curtain finally came down. This wasn't the first time an A4 had appeared at Waterloo. Mallard had worked out of the Southern terminus in the summer of 1948, during what became known as the Great Locomotive Exchanges. This was a series of test runs by examples of the leading locomotives of the Big Four, organised by the then new British Railways to try to find out what the strengths were of each, with a view to incorporating the best into the proposed range of standard designs. Mallard was tested on the Atlantic Coast Express from Waterloo to Exeter Central, the famous 11 o'clock train which served virtually every branch line terminus on the southern sprawling network of lines in Devon and Cornwall. The Ace had been a victim of Beeching and the Western region, running for the last time at the end of the 1964 summer timetable, its raison d'etre, the branch lines, being closed as soon after that as possible. Sir Nigel Gresley, Chief Mechanical Engineer of the London and North Eastern Railway, had once had an assistant who had left the LNER in 1937 to take up an appointment on the Southern Railway, and whose name would be forever linked to the last hurrah of Southern steam, Oliver Vaughan Snell Bullied. The last fleet of express passenger steam locomotives to work on Britain's railways were the Bullied Pacifics, assisted at the end by various standard classes. It is, however, the Pacifics which are remembered most fondly. The Southern, pursuing its aim of complete electrification of its system before the Second World War, had put steam locomotive building and development on the back burner. Steam was to be used only until the electrics took over. The war derailed the plan, and emergency measures had to be put into effect to renew the steam fleet as the completion of the electrification programme receded. Bullied, something of a maverick, something of a genius, and something of a visionary, grasped the nettle and produced some of the most advanced steam locomotives ever to run on Britain's railways in the form of 140 Pacifics of 2 varieties. The Bullied Pacifics in their original form owed something to the designs of Gresley, especially the A4s. Like those engines, Bullied's machines had 3 cylinders and much of their workings enclosed by external cladding. This cladding was described as air-smoothed rather than streamlined, and their valve gear ran in an enclosed oil bath. There were other deviations from conventional practice, and it remains a mystery today as to how Bullied persuaded the Southern Board and the government in wartime to finance the construction of such unusual machines. Whatever the merits or otherwise of the bullied features, it was shown in the locomotive exchanges that they were very expensive to operate, having a voracious appetite for coal. In the somewhat austere world of the nationalised railway this couldn't be tolerated, and 90 of the unconventional locomotives were rebuilt into the form seen here during the 1950s, producing an extremely elegant and modern but conventional-looking locomotive. Known collectively as rebuilds, there were two varieties of Pacifics split into three classes. This is a light Pacific, a member of the Battle of Britain class. It had once borne the name 145 Squadron, commemorating one of the fighter squadrons which fought over the southern skies during the Second World War. It was identical to the next Pacific we see, which was, confusingly, a member of the West Country class, and still bore its nameplate showing it to be Wimple, a station on the West of England main line. Members of the two classes were more similar to one another than to other members of the same nominal class, as there were variations in tenders and cabs during construction, the class names being spread unevenly through the various batches. They had proven to be a good investment in the end, and worked the last steam main line just as the Southern management had envisaged in its original pre-war electrification plan. There were 110 locomotives of the light Pacific variety, 60 of which were rebuilt. Through the cab window we get a glimpse of their original air-smoothed form. 14 of these originals or unrebuilts survived on the 1st of January 1967, the start of the final year of Southern steam. Just 2 of these were still running on the last day. In a support role to the bullied Pacifics at the end were a number of British Railways standard locomotives. These had been designed as go-anywhere, use-anywhere locomotives, which were, in contrast to the complex bullies, extremely simple to maintain and repair. 20 of these standard class 5 460s, to give them their clumsy full titles, were allocated to the southern region when built in the 1950s. This is one of 15 slightly smaller standard 460s on the southern, this time of class 4. They'd also been built for the southern and remained there all their lives, having double chimneys fitted at Eastleigh Works to improve their steaming. The other variety of bullied Pacific were the merchants, or packets, the latter referring to the first of the class, which was the first bullied Pacific of all. This was Channel Packet, progenitor of 30 Merchant Navy class Pacifics, which appeared in 1941. All were rebuilt in the 1950s into the form displayed by 35008 Orient Line, one of the initial batch of 10 and the last survivor and third longest lived member of the bullied Pacific type. We see her on the first official BR Farewell to Express Passenger Steam Special at 09:55 on the 2nd of July 1967, leaving Waterloo Station. 2 specials ran that day, although steam wasn't scheduled to finish for another week. Orient Line had had her nameplates refitted for this run, which took her to Weymouth and pleased the participants with speeds up to 88 miles an hour on the way out and 90 on the way back. The warship at the platform end is a reminder of the new order, although it was something of an interloper on the southern, being provided by the western region for the rump of the West of England services via Salisbury to Exeter. It's being passed by the second special, headed by the famous Clan Line at 12:20 and going only as far as Bournemouth. Giving a helping hand at the back was 82019, one of the standard Class 3 tank engines to which had fallen the final duties of Waterloo Station pilots and haulers of empty coaching stock trains to the carriage sidings at Clapham Junction. Although steam had nearly another week to go, these 2 trains ran on a Sunday, and the publicity attracted crowds at many of the intermediate stations to witness what was described as the celebration of the last steam main line in Great Britain. Curiously, the first train was routed onto the slow lines out of London, this being Rains Park Station just beyond Wimbledon. Many people were disappointed to find that the Bournemouth Bell, all Pullman train that day, was hauled by a diesel, a small batch of these having been loaned to the southern region for the last few weeks of the steam service, and thus spoiling the claim that the Bournemouth line services had gone direct from steam to electric without ever being dieselised. It seemed that British Rail, keen to make money out of those willing to pay the exorbitant fares on the two specials, were trying to avoid giving them the pleasure of seeing working steam in its final hours. The Southern, at least, had achieved its aim of almost complete electrification, and steam had finally gone.